Okay.
Hello, my name is Gary Scudder. I'm a professor here in the COR. I am ably assisted, almost as always, by the excellent Dr. Cynthia May Brandenburg, my partner in crime and traveling companion. And I want to talk a little bit today about something that I'm using in COR 110 as an experiment. I've talked before in other core talks about using artifacts. I'm a big believer in giving students something to analyze. And the more I teach, the more I tend to fall back on this. In the fall, I had in my class on Central Asia, had the students analyze a whole bunch of objects. And I'm experimenting with this semester in 110, and I've liked it a lot. And I've shared it with several of my colleagues who are also kind of enthusiastic about it. So I'm going to try it again in the fall with my regular 110. Mainly what I'm doing it is in regards to the Cynthia Freeland book, Portraits and Persons, which the students hate. Some reason for the freshmen, and mainly because I think the sophomores whisper into their ears when they're asleep, suddenly determine that they hate this book. Again, as everyone remembers, I'm the one person who voted against using this book, but actually I like it very much. I just tell the students the key is not to think of it like a typical art book. This is really a philosophy book dealing with the self, which uses art as an example. And if you take that approach with it, I think you'd be more successful. Nevertheless, I think I've always struggled, as most core professors have, with the notion of getting some traction with Freeland. And I've taken a bunch of different approaches. And what I'm doing this semester is I'm actually giving them some works of art to use using Freeland. So instead of like having them come in and say, okay, what did we learn from Freeland? I'm treating them like adults and scholars in that you will have read this before you walk in the door. So what's happened is the students come in and they will have been assigned, say, one of the chapters. And I do this not with the first chapter of Freeland, which I don't really like, but I do it with chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I devote an entire day to each one of these chapters. So every couple weeks we do this. And so the students come in, I tell them to group themselves up as they see fit, and they are only allowed to have a copy of Freeland. I also tell them they're allowed to bring in technology, but they're not going to be able to use it right away. So you can go ahead and have your laptop open, but you cannot access the internet yet. About a half hour of the way in, you can actually access the internet. Otherwise, no. I want them to struggle with the portrait and with Freeland for a while first. Now, what do I do? Well, essentially is this. For 20 minutes, I just show them an image, mainly a portrait, and they have to analyze it using Freeland and Freeland alone. And the reason why I do this is I try to express to them, I always ask this question, why do you think you're reading these books? And they'll grouse a little bit. And I said, the key reason is every one of these is an intellectual tool for your intellectual toolbox. Not simply because it's great to read, even though it is obviously great to read. I want you to think about how you pull the tools out of this. What also inspires me, I was just talking to my sophomores about the notion of digging deeper. And I find myself on almost every commentary writing, nice, but you must dig deeper in your analysis. You must go from the overt level down to the covert level. So I think more and more and more I'm forcing my students to do this in creative ways so they can learn to think. So they have 20 minutes just to struggle with Freeland and the portrait. So 20 minutes in, I tell them the name of the painting. I don't even want them to know the name until 20 minutes in. A half hour in, they are allowed to actually open the internet to do a little research, because I do not want them to have access to the internet right away, because I don't want them to just start dumping stuff from Wikipedia. I tell them clearly most of your stuff must come from Freeland. By 55 minutes in, and I have this all on Canvas, they have to, as a group, have posted their reflection. So essentially what they're creating is a 1 or 2 page bulleted, what the British used to call a white paper, telling me what you think, how Freeland relates to this, how Freeland has helped you understand this. So 20 minutes in, you get the title. Half hour in, you can open the internet. Everything must be done by 55 minutes. That gives us another 20 minutes at the end for a more general discussion and takeaway. So let me walk you through this. So my excellent assistant is going to now turn the camera towards the screen. Thank you. And the best part of this is you can hear Cindy humming in the background and all the things she films. This is what I show them when I do chapter 2 in Freeland, which is about contact. I don't know if this is actually art or not, because this is actually a picture that I took on a very rainy day in a strange cemetery in Lisbon, Portugal. But I love it. In this chapter, Freeland talks about the notion of art as almost a conduit to something bigger. I'm setting this up so that, and this is why she talks so much about iconography in this chapter and the Russian use of icons as a mechanism to connect you to the spirit of the dead. So what I want them to do is analyze this picture using the discussion tools that Freeland gives you in this chapter. Truthfully, I don't care what their answer is. I never care what their answer is. All that matters to me is they try to struggle with the concepts that Freeland, or for that matter anybody else, delivers. So as long as they show me that they've done it, in their little bulleted 2-page work, I expect them to quote Freeland specifically and tie it to aspects of this. I like this very much. This is your classic death mask, which a representation of death is holding. It's utterly creepy. While the students are doing this, I walk around and just kibitz with them. They tend to miss the point entirely. And eventually one of them will go, wait a minute, didn't he talk about death mask? And I'll go, yes. And they eventually focus on what they should be focusing on is this, though it takes them a while to get there. But again, they're freshmen. Okay. With chapter 3, this is on individuality. This is a Gauguin painting. I was not originally going to use this painting because I also use a Gauguin painting for my last one. And anyone who knows me knows Gauguin is my favorite painter. So I didn't want to overdo it with Gauguin. The reason why I chose this is the same week that this painting sold for the most money that any portrait ever sold in the history of the universe. So this is why I chose this, because it was also in the news. Though again, it's only about 20 minutes in that I gave them the title. In fact, this is Gauguin, and this is the painting, When Will You Marry? In this particular chapter, Freeland talks about different definitions of the self, such as the bodily self, the relational self, the reflective self, the moral self. And the interchange between these two characters allows the students to analyze this portrait using all of these different lenses. Now, Freeland talks about other stuff, and if they want to use other things, I'm perfectly okay with that. But this would be the most obvious one. When you get to chapter 4, this is her chapter on expression. And this is a really interesting chapter. It talks a lot about the eyes and the eyebrows and all the people who've talked about how one expresses individuality. I love this. This is a self-portrait by Anne Harris, which is called Self-Portrait with Jane's Eyes. So it's a self-portrait wherein the artist is also consciously putting in the eyes of somebody else, which leads to a very, very interesting discussion about how one does this, beyond the fact it just creeps the students out. So especially if you can time this to Halloween, this works very well. I love this. When we get to chapter 5, this is a chapter on self-knowledge. And in this chapter, Freeland talks a lot about narrative and the fact that she doesn't really believe that narrative exists in real life. She thinks it works very well artistically, especially in regards to literature, less so in art. This is really nice because on the one hand, the students are also at the same time reading the Pumpkin book, where Linden points out that the human brain wants to create a narrative, and now Freeland is saying there's no such thing as narrative. So it's good for them to see two scholars arguing about this point. I do something interesting with this one in the fact that this is what I want them to write on, but I don't start with it. I actually start with the original. As everybody knows, on the right, this is Picasso, painted in the 1950s. This is Velázquez, painted a couple hundred years earlier, his very, very famous representation of himself painting the Dauphin, that is, the Spanish royal princess. It's sometimes called the greatest portrait of all time, simply because you've got Velázquez in it, and in the back you see probably a mere reflection of the King and Queen of Spain coming by to see the royal family. So it's got all the classic Renaissance things. So I start off and just show them this alone for 5 minutes and let them process that. Then I say, oh, by the way, that's not what I want you to write on, which of course gets them riled up. Then we go back to the Picasso version of it, and they start sort of going through and matching up. You know, here's Velázquez, here's the princess, here's the dog, here's the dwarf, here's the king and queen in the back, here's the member of the royal family walking through it. Very, very iconic stuff. And talk about the fact of, can you actually have a narrative? Picasso had done this because he said if he were going to do a version of Velázquez's painting, it would change literally daily depending upon what kind of mood he was in or which way the wind was blowing. So it's about putting a narrative on top of a narrative on top of a narrative. And again, I don't care what they do as long as they struggle with this concept of narrative and how it relates to the concept of art, and for that matter, the concept of the self. Finally, we get to chapter 6 on intimacy. And I get to show what is actually my favorite painting of all time. This is another Gauguin called The Spirit of Death Looks On. And what I direct the students to is, in this chapter, Freeland talks about this philosopher by the name of Nussbaum and her 7 rules of objectification. 7 ways to consider whether something is objectified. And I asked them to, essentially, indirectly, to grasp the concept of whether or not Gauguin is objectifying the nude in this. And they struggle with this for about 20 minutes, and I give them the title, which is The Spirit of Death Looks On, which brings this whole more complex concept. This is not just some old woman of the tribe, this is the spirit of death. So it's actually this more mature, transcendent reflection upon the transient of human's life. And the students will then back off and say, well, wait a minute. If this is actually about something more profound, maybe, in fact, Gauguin is not objectifying her. If the point is that she represents the beauty and the lushness and the vitality of life, and death is always there, does this mean that she's not objectified because it's about something more important? But in the end, I sort of, especially when they start doing research, they figure out that this is actually Gauguin's 14-year-old girlfriend, which wrenches them back pretty dramatically once again, because if it's a 14-year-old, how could you not objectify a 14-year-old? And some students will then fall back on the cultural thing and go, well, yeah, but Tahiti in the 1890s, that's a whole other cultural thing. Again, I don't care what their answer is as long as they come up with an answer. So if you don't mind zooming out and coming back in again. Okay. These are the ones I used for this experiment. I think it worked remarkably well. It changed the dynamics up. It allowed them to do some group work. It also ensured that they had to have done the reading before they walked through the door, because you could tell the groups that did a bad job that started looking at the painting and then started reading the chapter. This is a very bad sign. But I really like the fact that it requires them to analyze the portrait in a very scientific way. And I sometimes think it's important for them to show either excellence or general buffoonery in front of other students. I think they're much more likely to take it seriously if they are going to be judged, in a sense, by their peers. I think you could do this with any number of paintings. Again, I don't think you're really looking for anything other than the process in and of itself. I've talked to several of my colleagues who like the idea, who also are going to experiment with this in the fall. As always, I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. I'm happy to talk about this further. And thank you very much.